speakers, whose bounties cannot be counted by reckoners, whose claim to obedience cannot be satisfied by those who attempt to do so, whom the height of intellectual courage cannot appreciate, the divings of understanding cannot reach, he for whose description no limit is laid down, no eulogy exists, no duration is fixed. Lord Almighty Allah sent His beloved Holy Majesty, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in fulfillment of His promise and completion of the Prophethood. Please send Durood Sharif in the court of Holy Majesty. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. In respect of the biography of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have been talking about the visit of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Taif and his invitation to the people of Taif, who, instead of accepting Islam, listening to the invitation of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they treated him in the worst manner possible, set goons and mischievous children after the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who threw stones on the Prophet of Allah, because of which his feet bled. Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam left Taif, and as I described that he took rest for some time in a garden near Taif, wherein he happened to meet a person by name Uddas, who recognized Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and embraced Islam. From there, the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to a place known as Nakhla, and he stayed there for a few nights. In one of those nights, the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was performing prayer, and it is said, dear servants of the Prophet of Allah, a group of jinns happened to pass by from there. They listened to the recitation of the Holy Quran by Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the prayer, and it is said that they went to their people, the other jinns, the clan to which they belonged, and they talked about the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the invitation of his and the truthfulness of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Most of the biographers had written that in fact they had admonished the other jinns. Dear servants of the Prophet of Allah, after that, Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam returned to Makkah. But before entering Makkah, it is said that he sent a word to one particular chief of Makkah, one of the chiefs of Makkah by name Mut'am bin Adi, who happened to be a very close friend of Hazrat Abu Talib radiallahu anhu, the uncle of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He sent a word to him saying that I would like to enter Makkah, for there was an apprehension at that time that the infidels of Makkah, upon learning the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not there in Makkah, they may create some kind of problem, they might create some kind of problem. And because of that, Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked Mut'am bin Adi, who accepted the request of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it is said that he sent all his children to the Holy Kaaba and came out himself and told people that he had provided protection to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he went to Holy Kaaba, the Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He came in the Holy Kaaba, kissed Hajar Aswad, offered 2 rakats of prayer. From there, he went back to his house. After few days, Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to Mut'am bin Adi and thanked him and said to him that I wanted your protection when I entered Makkah. Now I do not require any protection. For the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had one particular goal in his mind, that his mission was to invite people towards the folds of Islam. So only Lord Almighty Allah gives him protection as he has been protecting the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from all thick and thin throughout his life. And that's why the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, according to one version, after thanking Utam bin Adi, he said that I do not require any kind of protection. This could be understood from the fact that different biographers have interpreted this protection that Utam bin Adi provided in different ways. But what I feel is that the family and the uncles of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam were already there in Mecca. So there's a possibility that at the time of entry, there could be some kind of mischief from Quraysh. That could be one of the reasons why the Prophet of Allah sought Mutam bin Adi's help. Otherwise, when it comes to protection, the very life of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam suggested that he did not require any such protection. But you're living in a world of logic and reason, and Islam has been very reasonable in every aspect. So the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam must have asked Mutam bin Adi in the spirit that there shouldn't be any mischief and when the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam enters Makkah. Dear servants of the Prophet of Allah, after that the Prophet of Allah was often accompanied by Maulaya Kainat and his servant Hazrat Zaid ibn Harisa. Maulaya Kainat probably was 17, 18 years old, and one can understand the kind of the passion that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam cousin Maulaya Kainat must have had at that time. And if anybody did any kind of mischief, naturally Maulaya Kainat would retaliate. But it was not also possible for him to be accompanying the Prophet of Allah all the time. So often the Prophet of Allah would go alone, and people made use of that particular occasion and started making comments on the Prophet of Allah, throwing garbage, so on and so forth. There are plenty of such incidents. Remember, as long as Hazrat Abu Talib was alive, no incident could be detected or noted in the biographies. After Hazrat Abu Talib's demise, such incidents started taking place. And Maulaya Kainat, who was very young, he could have, on the instance of the Prophet of Allah, fought with these people. That possibility was there. But the Prophet of Allah never received any command from the Lord that says that if somebody tells you something else, retaliate. So there was no retaliation either verbally or physically. There was no concept of jihad by then. Jihad and the compulsion of jihad had been commanded only when the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did hijrat and he came and settled in Medina. In the entire 13 years of his invitation in Makkah, there was no order which commanded the Prophet of Allah, which instructed the Prophet of Allah to retaliate, to fight with the infidels, so on and so forth. So, but the Prophet of Allah did not stop from his mission. He would choose certain occasions to invite people towards the folds of Islam. And the will and the resolution and the determination of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was such that nothing could stop him. And one can understand from the fact that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, despite all these mischief by the Quraysh, he did not stop his mission. He continued inviting people. And people also started realizing, particularly those people who are young, they realized that there is something about his mission, there is something about his invitation. Despite all the problems that the people of Makkah created in his way, all kinds of mischief, all kinds of harassment that they could think of, they committed on the Prophet of Allah, inflicted on Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yet he did not stop from his mission. So people started appreciating the very determination and resolution of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Another thing was that the Prophet of Allah happened to be very clean from the beginning. And that's why he was always referred to as trustworthy, honest, a man of integrity, so on and so forth. So people started getting attracted towards the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, seeing his stand in every situation, and he did not succumb to any circumstances wherein he would stop from his mission of inviting people towards the fold of Islam, towards the submission to Lord Almighty Allah. That's what people felt, and they started attracting towards Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Dear servants of the Prophet of Allah, during this time only, Lord Almighty Allah, in order to give solace to the heart of the Prophet of Allah, called his beloved to his own manifestation, which we know as Miraj. Inshallah, we'll talk about it in the coming lecture. Please send Durud Sharif in the court of Holy Majesty. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina